The Chicago Bears narrowly miss out on trading for Matthew Judon. We're going to talk a little bit about that. Plus, the Bears players that are currently fighting their way through training camp that I think are probably going to end up on the practice squad. All that plus more right after this.
You are now tuned in to Chicago Bears Central, your number one place for all Chicago Bears news and content.
What's going on, Bears fans? Welcome to another episode of Chicago Bears Central, your number one spot for everything Chicago Bears related. I'm the host there, Haize, but more importantly, you guys can follow the channel at Chi Bears Central on every social media platform we happen to be on. With that being said, let's go ahead and get into this content for today, y'all. So let's first get up on what could have been, right? I'm not a woulda, coulda, shoulda guy by any stretch of the imagination, but this is a Bears channel, like we say, we're the number one spot for all Chicago Bears news and content. And because of that, it looks like the Bears did offer a third-round pick for Matt Judon from the New England Patriots. This is a guy who's played defensive end and linebacker, and a guy that could have definitely came in and shored up that opposite edge of Montez Sweat. And while, I do think that he would have definitely made the expectation even higher for the Chicago Bears team to be a playoff team heading into next season, which, hold on. Now it's a Chicago Bears Central episode. But with that said, he would have definitely helped strengthen this defense and that pass rush to make it even more elite. And Matthew Judon was a player that I've talked about a couple of times. We've had about two different episodes kind of breaking down his impact that he could bring to the Chicago Bears. While there's some injury concerns there, I think overall what you can take away from is that that Ryan Poles is still focused on adding and filling up the holes of this team. Now, maybe the Bears did get saved from themselves. Maybe Austin Booker, Daniel Hardy, maybe these guys are going to be ready to go. And when we look back on it, we say, hey, aren't you glad we didn't give up a third-round pick for an aging veteran, and we got these two young emerging edges who, even if one ends up being the starter, the other one ends up being a depth piece. Listen, they bring in that pressure and that we are developing guys from within without needing to give up assets. That very well could be how we end up looking at it. But overall, that means that Ryan Poles, don't overlook the fact that Ryan Poles could be looking to add an edge to this team when it's all said and done. So, we'll see. Ultimately, he ends up going to Atlanta for a third-round pick. And what it came down to, what we heard is that the Bears took the pick that they feel could be higher in the third round than the Chicago Bears third-round pick. And I think when you look at that, that just means, hey, teams around the league are maybe looking at it and saying the Bears are probably going to be pretty good this year. So, that's what it comes down to. Ultimately, I think Judon could have definitely helped this team. Make no mistake about it. But I'm not pissed or anything, or I feel like the Bears missed out in a huge way because we do have some emerging young edges that hopefully are going to be healthy. Like I said, Matthew Judon is a dog. Make no mistake about it. I don't want to, nothing that I'm saying here is to belittle Matthew Judon or who he brings or anything like that. Yes, only 4 games played last season, but he had 4 sacks, 15 and a half, and 12 and a half sacks the 2 years prior to that. This is a guy who can get to the quarterback. There's no question about it. But for a team that's young, a team that's emerging, and I don't think that Judon all of a sudden made this Chicago Bears team any type of necessarily Super Bowl contender or anything like that. He definitely helped strengthen what this defense is going to do for sure, which makes it easier on your linebackers, easier on your secondary. But I think we got some young emerging guys here that deserve an opportunity and a chance. But now the question is, how do the Chicago Bears pivot from this? With Ryan Poles not being shied away from going after and pursuing a veteran edge, does that mean that maybe Yannick Ngakoue enters back into the situation, right? Maybe that does. We'll see, man. I like I said, the fact that the Patriots also are quoted as saying they went with the pick they think is going to be higher in the third round, to me that says maybe teams around the league are realizing, hey, this Bears team can be pretty damn good when it comes down to it next season. And if they are, if we are, then more power to us, right? But like I said, I look at Austin Booker, I look at Daniel Hardy, I even look at Javon Dexter, not necessarily that he plays the edge, but like if he's what we've heard so far through training camp and he's that in actual games, that really does change the dynamic of what you need from your opposite edge. And, also it's not just trading Judon for a third-round pick. You also would have had to work out a contract extension with reportedly Atlanta has kind of the frameworks of a deal in place on a longer-term deal with Judon. So, that all plays into that situation. Again, I think if the Bears are going to go after a veteran, a guy like Yannick Ngakoue makes some sense if he's fully healthy, because you sign him to another shorter-term deal. If Austin Booker, if Daniel Hardy really kind of show that they're ready to go, then, at that point, you don't need the veteran. You don't need to pay that high, paid veteran in case, especially while you're already paying Montez Sweat. and you're starting to kind of line up your money and stuff to be ready for when Caleb Williams' contract is up. So, or contract extension is due. So I think that's really just what it comes down to overall. I'm not too overly upset by it. I've seen some Bears fans already that are kind of upset by the fact that the Bears didn't kind of pursue it harder with John. But at the end of the day, I think we're going to be okay. And that's not to say that we don't need to still add a veteran, just somebody who's kind of more shored up and a surefire thing. But I do think that the Chicago Bears are in a spot where we're going to be okay. I think we're going to be okay, man. I have that trust that this Bears team is going to be okay this year, even at the pass rush. When you look at how much and how consistent we were getting pressure on the quarterback at the end of last year, I think we'll see what it's done, man. But let me know what you guys think on that down below. As far as the Bears missing out on signing Matthew Judon, is it this huge thing that you're going to look back and say, hey, the Bears should have went ahead and pulled the trigger on it? Or are you like me and you look at it and say, we got some young emerging guys. Let's take a look and shot at them. If they don't work out, let's spend some money next offseason. Let me know. Or even at the mid part of the season with the Bears having $20 million in cap space. Let me know what you guys think on that down below. With that said, I want to get into the next part of this episode in which I want to talk about Bears players right now that are in training camp that could end up very well on the practice squad. And not to say that these guys couldn't eventually make the roster later down the road. Some of this is a mixture of circumstance as far as position, depth, things like that. And some of it is that maybe some guys just aren't ready. The first one that I want to talk about as far as a guy that I do think is going to end up being on the practice squad for the Chicago Bears is a guy that I just alluded to a little bit, and that's Daniel Hardy. I think that Daniel Hardy has looked really good, make no mistake about it. But unless the Chicago Bears plan on waiving one of Dominique Robinson and or a Khalid Kareem, I think that the path for Daniel Hardy may be to spend 1 year on the Chicago Bears practice squad. He was an undrafted free agent. So, he already was going to have kind of a battle to get to being on the final 53-man roster. Now, for his credit, he's looked pretty damn good. He's had 7 pressures so far in the preseason so far for the Bears, 2.5 sacks. He looked good in the Hall of Fame game. He looked really good up against the Bills as well. Jacob Martin has looked extremely solid. And I'm sorry, not Jacob Martin. Daniel Hardy has looked extremely solid. And I think if Dominique Robinson is cut, we could end up seeing him stay here. But when you look at Jacob Martin, who's banged up, when you look at Dominique Robinson, who hasn't really impressed, Daniel Hardy has a path to make that final 53-man roster. But I think when it all comes down to it, he's probably going to end up on the practice squad if I had to guess. But again, this could change from one game to the next. So if he has another big game with getting multiple sacks and Dominique Robinson we're still looking at him and saying, hey, Dominique hasn't showed us really anything, that could change. This is a fluid situation. But Daniel Hardy is definitely a guy that if he's not on that final 53-man roster, I think he has to be on that practice squad, and the Bears could hope that nobody signs him away. The next guy that I want to talk about is Reddy Stewart. Now, this is another undrafted free agent by the Chicago Bears. When you look at it, he does have a slot, an opportunity to make the final 3-man roster. But when you look at it, when it comes down to it, I think Reddy is he may end up on that practice squad. When you look at the depth that the Bears have, Kyler Gordon, Jalen Johnson, Jalen Jones, Josh Blackwell, Greg Stroman, Terrell Smith, there's a lot of guys out there when it comes down to it. And so while I think Stroman and Blackwell are going to play a lot on that special teams while being depth pieces, I think that Reddy Stewart may have to spend a year on that practice squad before eventually coming into it when it comes down to it. But again, he's a guy that I think has some upside of being on the final 53-man roster. But when you really look at the depth at the position that we have, it may just end up him being on that practice squad for the Chicago Bears. Another guy that we need to talk about is Jerome Carvin. This is another undrafted free agent here. When you look at it, when it comes down to it, he leads all offensive players in snaps so far this preseason. 71 snaps that he's played so far. He's played 3 positions as well. And when it comes down to it, this is a guy he's played at center. He's played all up and down that offensive line. And with the Chicago Bears needing depth at that offensive line, I can see them absolutely keeping Jerome Carvin. Now, we know that the starters haven't played a lot. We'll talk about as well, are the starters going to play against the Cincinnati Bengals? But overall, I think that his play, while not being amazing or anything, he's shown some really big versatility. And I think that he is a guy who could end up replacing kind of the Doug Kramer role, right? Meaning that Doug Kramer makes the final 53-man roster, but Jerome Carvin ends up being somebody who ends up being on that practice squad. Make sure you guys pay attention. Pay attention to him in the preseason. Like I said, he's flashed some really good signings right now, but at the end of the day, you look at how flexible everybody is. And if Nate Davis is going to be healthy, Matt Pryor, Ryan Bates. Unless we end up moving like a Larry Borm in a trade or something like that, I do think that Carvin ends up. He could end up being on that practice squad this upcoming year for the Chicago Bears. And again, for offensive linemen, if you can develop those guys, bring them along slowly, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But let me know what you guys think on that one down below. The next one that we got to talk about is Tommy Sweeney. Now, this is a guy who was a former 7th-round pick by the Buffalo Bills in 2019. He's flashed some things so far for the Chicago Bears. He's the leading receiver in the team in the preseason so far. He's caught all 5 targets that's been thrown to him and 76 yards on top of that and 1 touchdown. He's 4th in the teams in snaps played overall, and he leads all non-offensive linemen in snaps played. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's going to make the roster. There is a big uphill battle for him to make the roster. You look at Cole Kmet, Gerald Everett, Mercedes Lewis. These are all guys at that tight end position that are above Sweeney. But I think Sweeney has shown enough to where the Bears should want to keep him on their practice squad because, listen, Mercedes Lewis, we know he's the old vet, right? He's the dog. But, if he does end up going on somewhere else or finally retiring at the end of next season, you got a guy who's then been in your system, understands your offense, you're familiar with him, and as a third tight end, you could do a lot better, a lot worse than that as well. So I think when it comes down to it, Sweeney has a big chance to end up being on that practice squad for the Chicago Bears. I think that's a really good spot for him to be in as well. But that's kind of my thought process on that. You guys can let me know what you guys think down below. Who do you agree with? Who do you disagree with? Things like that. But let's talk about an article from Bleacher Report before we go. Bleacher Report had an article on one player from each team that should be on the trade block heading into the season. And for the Chicago Bears, they listed offensive tackle Larry Borm. Now, I've talked about how the Bears could waive Larry Borm. He has a non-guaranteed contract, $3 million with he's a dead cap of $30,000. That provides a lot of space potentially for a team. But that's also why Larry Borm could be used in the trade. And the reason why I say that is the Bears have $20 million in cap space. And Bleacher Report is pretty solid in listing him here with the Bears' $20 million in cap space. And Larry Borm not necessarily being a bad player, right? I want to make sure. This is not to say that Larry Borm is terrible, he's bad, or anything like that. But it comes down to the money. If you do make a trade, and the Bears do make a trade, as they reportedly were trying to do with Matthew Judon, if you end up including Larry Borm in that, the team could, very well take a look at him and then cut him if they need to. But he's had a lot of versatility over the course of his career as well. While he's had some things that have limited him, and definitely you don't look at him as a starting potential player at all, but he's a guy who provides some pretty good quality as a depth piece. But the question is he worth that money? And so that's why I do understand Bleacher Report listing him on here on this list as far as a player that could be moved for the Chicago Bears. I think that makes a lot of sense when it comes down to it. Now, we haven't heard anything to solidify that the Bears could be looking to move on from Larry Borm or they're not happy with Larry Borm. But we haven't heard anything great either, right? In the time period where we've heard a lot about offensive linemen stepping up and things like that, we haven't really heard a lot about Borm. Now, that could be because he's just doing what he needs to do and not necessarily excelling. Just because you don't hear that somebody excels doesn't mean that they're being bad either. They could just be coming in doing their job day in and day out. But I think that Larry Borm offers a unique opportunity if you do look to move on from him, that it makes sense when it comes down to it. And so we'll see what happens with Larry Borm. I look at Larry Borm and I say this, the same thing I've kind of felt about Borm, is that if he remains on this team, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I don't look at Larry Borm as somebody that absolutely has to go. I look at him as he could provide some flexibility if you want to make a move, either signing somebody or you want to make a trade. You can use his contract. It makes some sense, right? But I think ultimately it just comes down to how the Bears view Larry Borm and how they view this overall offensive lineman as well. I know a lot of Bears fans, how I was one of you guys just a week ago, have been talking a lot about this offensive line and how disappointing it's been. But really, when you look at it in games, it hasn't been overall that disappointing. So I think when you come down to it is that you very well may see the Bears just be confident in what they have and want to roll with that, maybe make a move later down the road, which could leave Larry Borm on this team for the foreseeable future, or you could cut him. You could use that cap space to sign somebody else. We're maintaining some more flexibility, or you can include him in the deal, and then the team that trades with you could get that flexibility. So I think a lot of different scenarios for Larry Borm. But if I had to guess the most realistic one, I think Larry Borm is still going to be on this team when it's all said and done. But let me know what you guys think on that down below. We're getting closer and closer to cut day. By the way, matter of fact, I think it's next week, cut day. after the game, yeah. So we'll be talking probably around this time next week after the Bears game, maybe even before, of some cuts. Make sure you guys stay tuned in for that. Now, with that said, I also want to go to Bleacher Report for another article. This one was looking at the highest free agent bust potential for each team after training camp. And so, listen, initially DeAndre Swift was listed in a lot of lists like this as far as a player that the Bears shouldn't have signed or they overpaid or things like that. But in this one, it actually listed as the second highest player on this list of free agent bust potentially is Kevin Bayard. Now, that's surprising to hear from me. When you look at it, I think Kevin Bayard fits perfectly well with what Jaquan Brisker is, and their skill sets fit each other well. Now, Bleacher Report in this article point out the fact that he's turning 31, that he's starting to already have diminished returns as a safety in the NFL. They also point out the fact that in 16 games with the Titans and the Philadelphia Eagles last season, he allowed a passer rating of 102.1 in coverage. So, hey, when you look at that and you say, hey, maybe there are some things there that are signs with Kevin Bayard. Now, I do think that Kevin Bayard was on teams that had their own issues going on. I also think that the overall strength of this secondary is a thing as well as why Kevin Bayard could and should work for the Chicago Bears. When you look at giving a player a 2-year, $15 million contract, I don't necessarily look at that as a bad contract in Kevin Bayard. Like, I just don't. I don't look at it that way. Now, I do think that the Bears very well, as soon as this upcoming draft and offseason, could look for a more long-term safety acquisition that could still leave Kevin Bayard starting for the year. But when you look at also, they point out in this article by Bleacher Report that Geno Stone, Justin Simmons, Cameron Curl, and Xavier McKinney were all options also available this offseason for the Chicago Bears. And I get what you're getting at with those guys. Those are all very solid guys. But I think that Kevin Bayard is going to be exactly what you need him to be. You need to bring in somebody who fits next to Jaquan Brisker. You needed to bring in somebody who is overall just solid and contributes to what you're already building with the secondary. And I see Kevin Bayard being that for the Chicago Bears team. I don't necessarily agree with this. I don't know who I would pick as a potential free agent bust either. I think the Bears made all really solid, smart decisions with their free agency this upcoming year. In my opinion, both the trades and the signings that they've made, I feel like they had a really solid offseason personally. So I don't know if I pick anybody to be a bust. You know, Kevin Bayard, it seems like maybe there's some doubt around him because of age while we're very youthful in our secondary. But I think overall, Kevin Bayard is going to be fine. But before we go, we got one thing that I do want to talk about and bring up. So there's been questions on after the Cincinnati Bengals announced that the starters will not play in their preseason game against the Chicago Bears. There's been some questions on if the Bears would also sit their starters. Well, this one comes from Brad Biggs of the Chicago Tribune, who says this. My hunch is the Bears will hold out their starters, or the vast majority of them, and say the joint practice Thursday is a very valuable experience. If that's the case, the next question is, what will happen August 22nd in the preseason finale at Kansas City? Will the starters play in that game? In last summer's final exhibition, offensive starters play anywhere from 13 snaps, that was Justin Fields, to 17 snaps for offensive linemen, and TJ Edwards and some linebackers started as many as 21 snaps. It's possible Eberflus will choose a similar approach this year. Now, we've had one game so far in the preseason of our starters starting, right? Just one game so far. And so the Bears have talked about wanting to get about 55 snaps for Caleb Williams. I believe he played 18 in that first preseason game. We got 2 games left. And so if the starters do sit this game, that would mean that if you want to get to that 55 mark, Caleb Williams is playing maybe a whole quarter, maybe a whole half. And I don't know if I see the Bears doing that either. Now, I get it. The Bengals are sitting their starters, having a joint practice today, which, by the way, the joint practice today was closed. It was supposed to be an open practice. It was shut down and closed in because of weather, but they're still going to have the joint practice, so look out for details from that as we do our normal training camp breakdown. But overall, I don't know. I don't know how to feel about it. Selfishly, I want to see the starters play. I want to see more of what the starting offense looks like. I want to see all of that, plus the Hard Knocks aspect of it. We're going to get another Hard Knocks episode with no actual starters playing in a preseason game. I think the more likely scenario, I hope, let me not say I think, I hope the more likely scenario is that we just see the Bears starters maybe play one series instead of the 2 that they played last time. And I don't think that that's a bad approach to it at all. I think that this, overall, what I'm taking from this Bears team, whether right or wrong, is very confident of the talent they have here internally. And that may lead to the fact why they feel like they're okay with not necessarily playing a bunch of preseason games. I know that sucks for fans. I know that fans don't have that because we're not in every single practice to know and have that safety and feeling like this team is ready to go. But if the coaching staff has that and the front office is right along with them in that, that could very well explain why we're not going to see the starters here for the Chicago Bears against the Cincinnati Bengals. But let me know what you guys think down below. When you look at it, should the starters play in your thought, kind of separate your selfishness as a fan of course, wanting to see your guys play, but do you think they should play for the Chicago Bears in the next preseason, or do you kind of understand what this team is trying to do in sitting their starters, resting those guys, and seeing what they can bring? Let me know all that down below. Make sure you guys are following the show at Chi Bear Central. You can send us any feedback, questions, comments, concerns, ChicagoBearsCentral@gmail.com. Lastly, if you want to leave a text message and our voicemail for the mailbag, the number to do so, 773-242-9336. We are the number one spot for everything Chicago Bears related, but that's thanks to you guys. And like I like to end every episode on, Chi-Town up, but Bear down. Love you guys. Peace, y'all.
This has been a presentation of the Break Media.